with the Forest Service, and I'm a public information officer on what's known as a Type 2 incident management team. So I get dispatched out to fires primarily in the Pacific Northwest, but we go wherever we're needed. So that's a little bit about me and my current role. And so here today, I'm wearing both hats for that.
Thanks, Jodie. And we also have Christie Shaw.
Hello, I'm going to apologize. I have 3 screens going, so I have to try to make sure to look at the right screen that has the camera. My name is Christie Shaw. I'm the Public Information Officer for Oregon Department of Forestry's Central Oregon District, which means that I cover everything from fires to forest practices to anything like that that's information-wise for our district. I also am the Deputy PIO on Oregon Department of Forestry's Incident Management Team 3 this year. And I'm a PIO 2 qualified, and I've been doing this for, I want to say, like almost 20 years now. I feel like I'm getting old, but so I've been around for a while doing it.
Thanks, Christie. So did you want to go ahead and get started?
I will. So I'm going to share my screen here. I have to make sure I share the correct one as well. Again, thank you guys for having us. It's a great opportunity. And I will say that for me, the biggest part of this is really focusing on the relationship building between fire information and the public affairs officers and PIOs and the media and journalists, and making sure that we build that relationship. And so I appreciate being here. Oops. So I'm covering kind of like basic wildfire information, and that runs from both being working with wildfire response agencies and also some of the terms that you'll hear us use, and then some places that you guys can go and look at for additional information that you might not get from the PIO, or that might help you prepare as you start to plan what your story is going to be and how that's going to work. Wildfire agencies. So you'll see all of these folks around, and it's really a big piece for us. That's like, we're part of what we call the complete and coordinated system for wildfire response in Oregon. And that basically encompasses all of these actual wildfire response agencies, but it also incorporates things like DEQ and other state and federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife, things like that. It's what allows us to do our job. It also includes landowners and folks like that. The Department of Forestry is a landowner wildfire response agency, as well as like the Rangeland Protection Associations are landowner-based responsibilities as well. We work a lot with each other, and our intent is always to be the closest forces. So you may see, you may be on a fire and see that you think it's on private land, but there's Forest Service resources there. That's really because they were either the closest response, or they provide additional capacity for us. And that's one of the things that's super important to understand, is that we all work together. We have those relationships that we really focus on. And we do that in the PIO world as well. Oftentimes, like here in Central Oregon, we have what we call a duty officer rotation. And so if you call for information about a fire out of our local dispatch center, you may get a Forest Service person responding to questions on a fire on a state jurisdiction. So when I talk about like building those relationships, if you want to know who the, who's the lead agency and who should you be talking to, it's really helpful if you build those relationships now with us, because then when you call us, we know, one, who you are, and when we have that relationship, but two, we can say, oh, it's not me, it's somebody else for the different agency, or it's a local fire department or something like that. But that allows you to know, to have those conversations that we can direct you to the right people. But never, I think, always asking the question and contacting us is great. Even if we're the wrong person, hopefully we can help you get to the right person. So I threw a few terms up on my screen, and again, I'm looking at other screens, so I apologize. But so jurisdictional agency, like that's who has that responsibility. Like, who is the agency that's responsible for protecting that land? Oftentimes we have agreements in place where somebody actually may be the protecting agency for that piece of property, and it's just for efficiencies so that the correct people can get there in a more efficient manner, potentially because of where the location of other lands in that area are. You see I put dual protection up there. In some cases we have what we call dual protection, and that is we as ODF have protection on a piece of ground, but it's also within our rural fire district. And so they have protection responsibility in that area as well. And so you'll hear us say, like, one of us will have potentially the lead on the fire activity, but one of the other of us might be doing some of the reporting and things like that. We also, mutual aid is a really big part of our process in that we all support each other. So even if we don't have any type of responsibility in an area, we still potentially will send resources just to help our partners out, because we want everybody to be successful. And a big part of that is just like the less fire that's on the landscape allows us to respond to other fires. It reduces smoke impacts. It reduces damage to communities and natural resources. So we all participate. Again, it's that complete coordinated system, and that we all help each other out. I threw incident management teams in here just because even though they're not a lead agency, those incident management teams actually work for the agencies. It sounds kind of weird, but when they come in to take that responsibility and that workload away from the agencies that are there. And oftentimes we have multi-jurisdictional agencies. So we are working with our, for ODF, we're working with our federal counterpart, and those incident management teams will be working for both agencies. But they may be the person, so they may not be the lead agency, but they are the lead person that you should be contacting. Once an incident management team comes in, that's who you should really be working with to gain information about a fire. That being said, those teams work for those agencies. And I had an instance last year where local media wasn't getting what they needed from the team, and it wasn't, they just weren't getting what they needed. And the local media contacted myself and my federal counterpart and said, hey, we're just not getting a call back. And that's where we can step in and say, like, talk to the team and be like, hey, you need to engage with the local media, or we're getting reports that you're not responding back, because they work for us and we want to make sure that they're doing what's expected, and they may just not know, or maybe struggling and not have the capacity. And so you still can interface with us if things aren't going well, but they really are the lead when it comes to a fire once they're in place. The other piece I put on here is evacuation. So as fire agencies in Oregon, we do not, we influence evacuations. We have conversations with the sheriff and emergency manager, but they are the ones who make those decisions. They're the ones who do the evacuations and things like that. That doesn't come from fire agencies. So if that's part of your storyline or part of your interest, we aren't going to be able to answer those questions. We're going to end up referring you back to the sheriff's office or to the county PIO, depending on how they're handling it. And then now we come to, and I don't know like everybody's experience that's on here, but we come to kind of some of the terms of it. And so when we talk about initial attack, or like hear us say IA, that's that first burn window when we're like, the resources are local resources, it's us working together. And that's where we are still super engaged at the local level. When we get into extended attack, we are still the ones who are working on that, but we may have gained some resources from outside the area who are providing support, so that our, what we call our initial attack resources, can then be available during the next burn period, that they can go back and engage on any new starts and things like that. Then you'll see, and part of extended attack is having a type 3 management team come in sometimes. Oftentimes those type 3 teams are made up of local resources, and it's usually interagency. And it's just an opportunity for us to broaden and expand that system so that we can have more capacity in there. And also, again, take some of that burden off of maybe a local agency that's, by making it interagency, we're able to kind of inject additional folks, either maybe outside the area or outside the agency, that helps them provide support. And then the type 1 and 2 incident management teams, I think everyone's probably familiar with those. but that's really where we start to see, folks from outside the area, and they're taking that burden off the local district or local forest. And they bring in a lot more capacity that we don't have the ability to supply locally. In Oregon, we have 3 incident management teams. The Pacific Northwest, and Jodie's going to be able to answer this better, but I think there's 11. There's a couple numbers that are skipped, and so I think there's that. But then we have the ability to pull them from other regions in the US. And so you may come to a fire in Oregon that's actually has an incident management team from New Mexico or somewhere else like that, depending on how fire season is operating at the time. One question I always get asked, like if I put out the cause of a fire and I say it's human caused and under investigation, people always ask, does that mean it's arson? Oftentimes it's not arson. Arson fires are actually fairly rare. Most of the time it's some sort of a negligent or accidental start that we then have to determine what the actual cause was so that we can then tie it back to that incident. I see there's a bunch of things in the chat, but I'm not sure if I should wait, April, and see if there's any questions there, or I'm not looking at it.
We'll save questions for the end.
Okay.
We have like a half an hour scheduled, but if you could just keep an eye on the time. I think between 12:20 and 12:25 should be good.
Okay, perfect. Some other key things in terms of what does something mean. So fire line, there's lots of ways that we can say fire line. We talk about hand line, dozer line. Those are basically something down to mineral soil. So it's going to be something that we actually dig, construct either with a piece of equipment or hand tools and that kind of thing. When we talk about wet line, we often use that in a scenario where there's grass or light fuels, and we're able to like wet the fuel down before the fire gets to it, and that will actually provide us an opportunity to then get in there and push that fire line back in there. Cold trailing is just where something may be burned to, but it's no longer active and hot, either because it got put out by water or something like that. And we'll actually go along and feel for heat in there. And that might be what the fire line ends up being. And then sometimes there's a natural barrier or an existing road or feature that's being used as part of the fire line. So it means kind of a variety of things in there. Other parts to talk about on the fire, the head, which is the front, that's the flaming front, that's the direction the fire is moving. Sometimes there'll be multiple heads on a fire, just depending on the topography and weather and things like that that might be influencing it. The heel of the fire is the back end of the fire. It's typically the part that's not growing or that they've already established a control line on or a fire line. And so that's considered the heel of the fire where it's not progressing and moving from. In some instances, you'll see that fire is moving in all directions. The flank, you'll often hear them talk about flanking a fire. And so that's moving kind of along the side of the fire where it may have some active flames, but it's not the growing part of the fire. And we often usually try to anchor into something and then move our resources along the flanks of the fire and try to pinch it off at the head by moving adjacent to the fire. And then you'll hear us talk about the origin of the fire. That's basically, we always try to protect the origin, and that's because that's where the investigators are able to go back in and try to figure out what the burn patterns are indicating and what we can tie the cause to. And sometimes it's a lightning tree, and that's super easy and that's great. But oftentimes they're looking for burn patterns and how the fuels burned to be able to figure out what the cause is related to. Fire behavior, creeping, running, torching, crowning, spotting, smoldering, those are probably terms you guys are all familiar with, but oftentimes that's what we're really focusing on when we start releasing information is like, what's the fire behavior actually doing? And is it something that we're going to be able to catch based on that fire behavior? You'll also hear us talk about mop-up. And that's just mop-up is one of those things. It's a really difficult, arduous task that our folks engage in. And it's trying to make sure that there's no residual heat in there so that the fire doesn't come back. It's what actually allows us to, when we start talking about contain and control, that's what allows us to increase that control number, because that's it's our confidence that the fire is not going to come back around and create additional issues in those areas where we consider it to be controlled. Contain and control is always one of those topics that we talk about, and everyone asks, well, what exactly does it mean? So contain is a line around the fire, that we have fire line built around it, whatever type of fire line I referenced above, around a certain percentage of the perimeter. That's and how we feel whether or not that's going to slow the spread of that fire and stop the spread in those areas. The control piece is really whether we think that we've pushed that line back far enough into the fire that it's not going to come out. Oftentimes you'll see that we don't actually control a fire until the fall when it comes to big fires. And that's because of our concern that and potential of something coming outside of a fire, especially with interior fuels and burning inside the perimeter of the fire. Oh, sorry. A lot of times we'll talk about what's on the fire, the resources that are there. And we have a whole lot of what we call fixed wing. So those are basically airplanes, anything that we call as a fixed wing aircraft. And then we also have the rotor wing, which are helicopters, and a variety of sizes of those. Some of the other pieces that we really use, we use skidgens, engines, and dozers, and that's for transporting water to the fire, as well as continuing to increase the width of a fire line and things like that. Personnel on the fire, a lot of times you'll hear us say overhead, and that's always when someone asks me, like, what does overhead mean? So that can be our incident commander, it can be PIOs, it can be people who are running logistics and things like that. So that it's a variety of people. It can also mean like our operations section chief who's in charge of the operations on the fire, and division supervisors who are there running different portions of the fire. In there, you'll see that I have AIC on this list. So in Oregon, the state of Oregon, we work with our Department of Corrections for using adults in custody for a variety of ways. They can work on the fire itself. They can also be in camp, but you'll see those in there. Anytime that you want to do any stories with adults in custody, that needs to be through the Department of Corrections, not through us. And typically if it's on an incident management team fire, we can work with Department of Corrections and help you navigate that if you're interested in it. Weather, red flag warnings and fire weather watches. Those are always ones that come up, as well as like sometimes you'll hear us talk about LALs of 3s or things like that. And so we watch and monitor the weather a lot, and you'll see that when the red flag warning comes out, that's really where it's kind of imminent that there's going to be a critical fire weather pattern. The fire weather watch means that it's like, well, we think it could come in and it may or it may not. And then usually as we get closer to a certain time period, they'll upgrade that to either a red flag warning, or they'll downgrade it and say that it's not going to actually appear. It's kind of a confidence thing. And we work really closely with the National Weather Service to provide our fire information or fire weather information. And so that's who we rely on to provide us that intel. And I will make this, I've already shared it with April, and so she'll make it available for all of you guys. There are these links that are here for where you can get some more information. If you're not familiar with WildWeb, that's tied to all the interagency dispatch centers in Oregon and across the nation. And it usually provides you kind of our IA information in terms of like where the fire is located, who's potentially the jurisdictional agency, if it's not multi-jurisdictional. And it also gives you a little bit of basic information. Oftentimes the information on there doesn't get updated as quickly as what's occurring. So that's just a starting point for you. But really talking to your local PAO, PIO is going to give you better information. NCWeb, great when we have bigger fires. It's going to provide you a lot of information, pictures, things like that, that maybe can help you get started on developing your story. The Northwest Coordination Center, NWCC, they also do a situation report every day. It kind of gives you information about larger fires. If you're doing a kind of a bigger landscape type story, a good place to start and get information, and then dive in from there. ODF has their own blog spot as well that talks about fires on our, so oftentimes on the landscape, but also on our protection. And then I put the OEM dashboard on there. I think it's super helpful in that it talks a lot about evacuations and things like that are usually included on there. NIFC also has some things that I thought were useful for you guys potentially in terms of like expectations of your what to expect if you're going onto a fire line. So I put that one in there. But I also, the biggest one I really encourage is that you use the local resources. that are available. Almost every interagency dispatch center has a local point of contact for on the web that has like where we report information, and that provides a lot of intel in there in terms of what's going on with it. So I encourage you to look now for those, and if you can't find them, reach out to your local folks and they can help point you in the right direction. And then there's just some basic information that I threw on there as well that has a lot more terms than what I went through, but also some training courses and things like that that will, some of those are really interesting in terms of what fire behavior can be like, and that might provide you a background in terms of if you're thinking you might be reporting on wildfires this year. And I think I went over my allotted time, but hopefully I covered a lot and did it quickly.
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much, Christie. So now let's move, and like I said earlier, we'll have a Q&A at the end of all of this around 1. So moving on, for this interest of time, Jodie, did you want to get started?
Yes, I will share my screen and run through my PowerPoint. And like Christie, I'm on multiple screens, so let me get it in front of me. So I'm going to cover today talking about the PPE, location, and knowing ahead of time what you need for your story, and a few thoughts on getting ready, and then just being flexible. So first, we're going to start with personal protective equipment. This is actually a photo taken from 2014 when we had the Two Bowls fire here. I was on our city council. I was serving as mayor pro tem. The mayor was out of town, so I was the acting mayor. And this was the first time I'd gotten up close to a fire in that capacity. I'm actually the third person from the left, and we were taken out, given protective equipment to be on the ground out in post-fire. Some of the things I have learned since are what not to wear. And I know some of you probably already know this. You may have seen the many memes of Lydia Cummings from 2016 being carried. This couple had offered to carry her, and she thought that it was rude to turn them down. But during a flood, embarrassed her news station and ended up being fired for it. Similarly, we have reporters show up in all sorts of attire. We do have some PPE available, but again, thinking about your professionalism. The other photo is actually a reporter out of LA. That's a real person and a real public information officer. But we often would not encourage you to wear crop tops or have bare skin showing if you're going out with us to a fire line. So just some common sense goes a long way. Some of the things that we often recommend, and this may again seem obvious to some of you, but as recent as last summer, I've experienced new reporters not knowing some of this, to have closed-toed shoes, preferably boots, to just wear long leg pants, have a long sleeve shirt, have eye protection, a hat, a ball cap is fine, hard hat's better. If you have a face mask, either an N95, KN95, or a bandana, should you encounter some smoke. Some leather gloves with you, just in case if there's things you want to be handling, or we get in an area that requires that. And then the Nomex jumpsuit or clothing. I know some media outlets keep a stock of these. I know some don't. Some of the rural areas that we've been to, we actually can borrow from our cache once we're on an incident. So if you don't have this with you, it's something you can ask for. Again, any of these things, similar with a hard hat, if you don't have that, and as a PIO, if I'm taking you to an area that it's required, I will try to find one in our cache for you to use, because we want to make sure that your safety comes first. And the fire shelter piece, we often have those as well. That's not something that most media outlets keep on hand, and you shouldn't have to necessarily. That's something that we will often take care of if we're taking folks to an area. We'll discuss that, but usually we're just heading towards the fire line, or we're having interviews in areas that don't require that type of PPE for the people that we're escorting. And then let me get my cursor. Want to talk a bit about location, where you are.
Just a heads up, I don't hear the audio for this.
Oh, you can't hear the audio?
No.
Oh, thanks for letting me know, because I can hear it just fine.
Usually you have to share the audio separately.
Ah, gotcha. Well, I'll talk over it then. So what the reporter was saying as they were there was how he had to move his rig. The firefighters had backed away from the fire, and he had moved away from the fire. So then as they get further on, as he's reporting, and we aren't going to discuss or go into detail about how close reporters can and can't get to fires. We know Oregon's law will be changing next year. But let me get closer to where this reporter, even though he moved his rig, he still wanted to get close to the flames, was reporting live from this, and starts talking about a helicopter that's coming in close. And you can hear the helicopter coming, and he's still reporting and talking about the flames starting to jump the highway. Of course, there's fire personnel there to keep him safe, but he happened to get underneath a water drop. And his comment was his boss he's gonna need to talk to his boss about this, because certainly there could have been damage to his equipment. Not the safest place to be. And that's something that I just wanted to share. As we go out on fires, we want to keep you safe. So we want to make sure that we know what are you looking for? What are you wanting to get some close up shots of flames? Are you looking for aerial shots of the smoke column? When is your deadline? And our job is to help give you as much information as we can, as soon as we can get it. And that's where, like Christie was saying, building the relationships now with your forest folks, and then with the incident management team. When we come onto a fire, it's usually gotten pretty big. Like Christie mentioned, there's 12 teams in our region. And in addition, there's 3 state fire marshal teams for structure protection. So when we show up, we're going to be there for 2, maybe 3 weeks. We're the ones sending out those daily press releases. We're the ones trying to get the photos to connect with you and to relieve our agency partners so they can do their day job while we focus on the fire and the fire information. So it's really helpful to have an idea of what you're looking for. And if we can accommodate it, we will try. We'll have you come out, we'll do a safety talk, we'll make sure that we get you as close to what you want as quickly as we can. So things that you can ask is who can best help you achieve what you're looking for. It is really helpful to have media folks and journalists just be upfront with what they know, what they don't know. And like I said, our job is to help tell that story, to help convey to the community with care that we're managing a fire for their safety. We're coordinating with so many partners that we want to make sure that we help you achieve the goal of conveying the messaging to the community on the ground. And then what location, it's great to ask, like back to the framework, knowing what you want, then we know better where to take you in the fire safely. And I know April's going to go into a little more detail on this as well, but one of the things that I would strongly encourage you to do is have a go bag or a kit. As a public information officer, I keep Rubbermaid totes in my garage and a couple of duffel bags that are ready to go with all of my supplies. It's important that you keep enough fuel in your vehicle so that if you do report out that you know that you can get where you need to go and get back safely. Having an extra set of clothes in your vehicle is helpful. You're going to probably get dirty and dusty. You might want a change of clothes. That PPE that we talked about earlier, having some of that available and on hand. Snacks and hydration. You never know how long you're going to be out working on a story or how far you may have to go. And we'll talk about this, being flexible. Make sure you bring enough, especially hydration, if you're going to be out in the field. Sunscreen, bug spray, very important. As you know, in Oregon, we want to make sure that you're not going back, especially if you're in broadcast media, on air with a sunburn or bug bites that get in the way. First aid kit is helpful to have with you as well, and an emergency contact list with you. Heaven forbid something really goes sideways, but having that emergency contact list with you or in your vehicle is important. And then being flexible, understanding that things may not go according to plan. It's okay to have multiple objectives when you're coming out to the field or working with a public information officer on an interview. And it's okay to ask if things can change, or if you change the course of what you're working on, we will adapt to help you get the right story. And we want to make sure that you also understand that as hard as we try, things may not always go as we plan either when we try to take you out. And we try to accommodate. Last year, I remember a fire where I had a really great young reporter came out to do some interviews, and she was wearing wedge sandals. So we had to adapt to what we were going to cover that day and where she could actually go. We didn't have an extra set of shoes for her to wear when she showed up. And so we changed things up. She still got a wonderful story out and great interviews with folks, but we just did it in a different environment where she could stay safe and not have to take her wedge sandals out into uncomfortable territory. So protecting life and property will always be our main objective, and we hope it is yours as well. So when we go out in a fire, we want to make sure that being flexible, if we need to change things up because things might be getting unsafe, that you'll understand and be accommodating to that. We're not trying to withhold anything. We're not trying to not tell you things. We just have to make sure that we're meeting the objectives of the agency that has brought us in to manage the incident. And then if you can't get exactly what you want, what is the next best thing? What would be an alternative for you? Back to that framework conversation, knowing what you want when you reach out to a public information officer. It's really helpful for us to know, do you have an alternative? Or if we're not meeting your objectives, what can we do that's the next best thing for you? And then I just throw in this quote, excellence does not require perfection. We often say in our work, semper gumby, be flexible, understand that we are going for excellence in our work, and we want to maintain professionalism. It may not always look perfect, but we'll do our best, and hope that you understand that as well. And with that, I knew I wouldn't take my full 20 minutes, so I wanted to leave some time for April, because I know we overlap on some of the things that we're covering, and then we'll come back to more of a general Q&A and more dialogue. I would be curious to hear, April, from some of the group, some of their stories and experiences that could help Christie and I as we do our work.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay, so I'll go next, and then we will launch into the Q&A. So let me share my screen. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I had been covering wildfires on the Oregon-California border for Jefferson Public Radio before I recently joined OPB. And after I had been doing that for a few years, the Alameda fire came through Talent and Phoenix in the summer of 2020, and it burned most of my neighborhood. I had to evacuate. I thought I lost my house that night. I did evacuate twice. So that was a pretty wild experience. And so anyway, I kind of compiled some stuff that are some lessons I learned in the process of covering wildfires. I made a lot of really dumb mistakes, and I really hope that other people don't have to make them as well. So as we discussed earlier, you should really have a plan. I used to, as soon as I heard that there was a fire, I would hop in my car and go to it. There was a fire in Redding, California, a couple hours south of my station, and it was going to destroy hundreds of homes. And so I hopped in my car and I went to Redding. Didn't know where I was going, didn't know where I needed to be, and it was not the wisest decision. And I think what would have really helped me was to stop and think, what exactly is it that I want to cover? Do I want voices of the people who have been impacted by this fire? Do I just want more information about the fire that I'm not getting from the PIO from my office? So as we discussed earlier, just kind of knowing that can help you work more efficiently, and it can help you figure out where exactly you need to go. If you are looking for personal stories from evacuees, you might want to go to an evacuation center, or you might want to go to a business where a lot of people are stopping because that's just where they can stop. If you just drive around a perimeter, you'll find people congregating and you can start talking to them there. Or do you want to do a story that's specifically about firefighters? You might want to talk to the agency PIO about that and just ask them, can I talk to some firefighters and just hear about what it is they're going through while they're on this scene? So the other thing I learned was that I can't do everything. I would often be on the ground collecting audio, quotes, information, and then I would go somewhere and do the reporting and put it all on the web, and it's really time consuming. What I think would be really efficient for reporters is to have somebody in the office collecting that information from you, so that you can focus being on the ground and doing what you need to do on the ground, and then you can provide that information to an editor or to a colleague who can then get that information on the web, on social media. And the person who's in the office can also help as a sort of coordinator. They can, be scouring Facebook or Twitter or websites for new information about the fire, to provide locations where you can go since you're on the ground. They can start calling businesses, nonprofits to find resources and sources for you for interviews and arranging those for you. It's really difficult to do all of that while on the ground because oftentimes you are running low on power, you know, you don't have internet, or you're just really busy. So if you can have somebody who you can coordinate with ahead of time, divvying up those responsibilities could be really helpful. And I kind of provide some examples of what that could look like. So, as we talked about earlier, you want to be prepared. In addition to personal safety gear, you know, I found that I have to have something to snack on because you will be running low on energy, and you have to make sure it's not something that'll melt. I made the mistake of bringing trail mix. I had chocolate in it, and it created a big mess in my car. Don't do that. One thing another wildfire reporter had suggested to me was carrying an EpiPen. There are really weird bugs that come out during wildfires, and sometimes people can have an allergic reaction to them, or maybe you're at an evacuation center and somebody has a reaction to something. It's just good to have something like that on hand if you can get it. You'll want to have a press badge on hand, and you'll want your health insurance card, just kind of the basic stuff that you should have when you're reporting somewhere. You'll want extra clothes, as mentioned earlier. Sometimes you will be reporting on a wildfire in an area that's really hot, but then it gets really cold at night. So you do actually want to have something warm just in case. You definitely want to have an N95 respirator. With regards to cars, I think it's useful to have a four-wheel drive vehicle because you don't know exactly where you'll be going. You don't know if you're going to be hitting some gravel roads. It kind of depends on what kind of reporting you're doing. If you want to get close to the fire, you're definitely going to want four-wheel drive. And sometimes even the community you're going to may have a lot of gravel roads. It's probably better for you to rent or borrow a car, borrow as in from your company if that's available, because then that's covered by insurance in case something happens to the vehicle. If something happens to your personal vehicle, I'm not exactly sure what sort of coverage you would have for that. So it might be better to rent or borrow one from your employer. Some other things that are useful to have: a portable car starter. That's something that can jump your battery or even put air in your tires in the event that something happens while you're out on the road. You want physical maps of the area because oftentimes during a fire, internet's down, power's down, and you don't want to be lost out in the middle of nowhere. And then also you'll just want to have some stuff on hand so you can do your job. Having a hotspot is useful. It's something that helps you gain internet access in an area where there is none, where you don't have Wi-Fi. You'll want some portable battery chargers for whatever equipment you're using, and you know, extra cables, SD cards, etc. Yeah, that's it on that. With regards to where you'll be sleeping, as soon as a fire hits, if you know you're going to be driving to it and it's far away, you'll want to book a room as soon as you possibly can, because motels and hotels get booked up really fast. Evacuees are looking for places to stay. So book a room if you can. If not, or even if you do, have a backup plan. You know, bring a tent, bring a sleeping bag, know where you can sleep safely and legally out in the field if that's something you need to do, or you can sleep in your car. I think usually at evacuation centers or churches, they have parking lots where a lot of evacuees are doing exactly that. So that could be an option for you too, depending on your comfort level. We covered this earlier, but I'll just reiterate some things. You'll want to start researching who your local agencies are, and you'll want to know how they normally share public information during a breaking news event. Everybody's different. Some agencies post things on Facebook, some post them on Twitter, some do both, some do just press releases. I think what would be really useful to you as a reporter is to know if there is a go-to person who you could call in the event of breaking news. And it certainly doesn't hurt to ask now, to ask them if there's somebody in the event of a breaking news event that you can reach out to for information right away. So you want to know who your local fire districts are, who your local representatives are for Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service. You'll want to touch base with the Sheriff's Department and the police departments to see what sort of rules and regulations they might have with regards to media access to emergency situations. When I was in Redding, California, there was a permitting system for media that I wasn't aware of, and a lot of the local law enforcement couldn't tell me exactly how to gain access because they weren't aware of it either. It was really frustrating. So what I eventually learned was that they wanted media to go to the Sheriff's Department and get a permit to gain access to roads that reporters should legally by California law already have access to. It's a whole thing. But in any event, it'll make your life a lot easier if you can contact them ahead of time and talk to them about that, just to see if you can be prepared for something like that when breaking news hits. I will touch briefly on HB 4087. That's the bill that passed this last legislative session that enables media access to emergency situations like natural disaster situations, primarily wildfires, but any other natural disaster event. That won't take effect until next year. And right now there is a committee working out the logistics of it. I'm on that committee. And so if you want more information, you can email me. But basically we're trying to figure out what are the requirements for journalists who want to access those areas. Very likely there will be a training component where you have to do some sort of training in order to gain access to disaster zones. But we'll know more after the summer when this committee finishes up that work. Moving on, American Red Cross is also a good agency to get in touch with. Usually people have a local American Red Cross spokesperson. You'll want to talk to them and kind of figure out what is your plan in the event of a mass evacuation situation. I had done that ahead of the 2020 fire season. They didn't really know where they were going to put people, which was also really interesting when we ended up having a massive wildfire and didn't know where to put people. But that in itself could be a story. It's also just good to know what the rules and regulations are for Red Cross evacuation centers. Generally, they don't like media to be there talking to people. So it's kind of good to know that ahead of time. But in addition to American Red Cross, sometimes there are churches that also put people up when there are mass evacuations. So you might want to call around to local churches too. So after you feel all prepared and it's time to hit the road, when I get to a fire scene, if I'm just looking for specific information about the fire, you know, like which way is it going? What areas are of concern? How is the fire acting? I find the incident commander and get that information. And again, I go to evacuation centers and churches to find people to talk to who've been impacted by the fire. If you're on a fire for a long time, it's one that's happening for days and days, and you want to get some diverse perspectives. It's useful to start reaching out to nonprofits, schools, people who serve marginalized groups, homeless shelters. You can get some really interesting perspectives about how the fire is impacting them individually. And it also just provides a lot of diversity to your coverage. So, and another useful thing is finding a place where you can actually do your job. I usually go to libraries. They're air conditioned, they have free internet, and I can charge all of my devices, and they're very quiet. But you can also find a coffee shop if you don't have an office nearby, like I did in Redding. You know, it's 2 hours away from the studio, so I had to camp out at some places. And this is kind of, this slide is basically a journalism 101, but I think they're good reminders. When you are out in a wildfire, especially in a neighborhood that's been decimated by fire, you're looking at people's homes, right? Like, and that's obvious, but I think it's worth remembering that this is somebody's entire life and it's just been burned to the ground. And when you post photos of those homes, sometimes that could be the first time they're seeing it. So don't walk over those properties. I mean, it's not safe. You don't know what kind of chemicals are in it. But also it's just not respectful, I don't think. I'm not going to tell you what you can and cannot do for your job, but I am just kind of saying ethically, it's probably not a good idea to touch other people's belongings, even if they've been destroyed by fire. What I normally do is I'll stick to the streets or to the sidewalks and have like a zoom lens and take pictures of like statues and things, you know, because we need photos with our stories, and those are the photos you're looking for. So the other thing is to remember that I think it's good to remind people why fires are happening. You know, when it's possible, always kind of remind people that this is something that's getting worse and is likely going to continue getting worse because of global warming. This provides the context for that. But then there's other contexts that you can be looking for too, like when the Alameda fire hit Jackson County. There's the context of the emergency response system. It failed a lot of people at that time, and whenever possible, we tried to provide that context to people that this is something that we knew was possible, but just didn't prepare for. And when it happened, we weren't prepared for it. But it also was happening at a time during a weekend when there were fires all across the state. So resources were already stretched thin, and this county in very southern Oregon was kind of far away from the center of where most Oregon things happen. So of course, naturally, we just didn't get as many resources as maybe some other areas did. Just stuff like that, these backstories, I think are interesting and obviously worth verifying with agencies to help provide people not just the cold, hard facts of what's happening with the fire, but also what background is it happening against. And then this is obviously pretty clear too, don't endanger others. That video we saw earlier of the reporter getting super close to the flames, that was incredibly irresponsible. If that person were to get too close to the fire and need to be rescued, they are putting firefighters in danger. It's, you know, you want to be aware of where you're parking. You don't want to park your car in an area that could block first responders from doing their jobs. Obviously, public information is incredibly important, but public or your own personal safety and the safety of others is highest priority. So just don't take any unnecessary risks. Be thoughtful and be smart, which is all kind of obvious, but I'll just say it anyway. So some other things that you can review ahead of time if you want to continue learning more about this. These are links, and I'll include these in the slides when we upload them to our site. But the SPJ Code of Ethics is good to have on hand. Print it, frame it, put it on your wall, read it occasionally. The Northwest Fire Consortium has a lot of really interesting handouts about kind of describing some of the terminology that Christie Shaw was going through at the beginning of this. And they also provide, you know, new research and studies about fire science that is good to have on background when you are reporting on this, on wildfires. And of course, you can always sign up for the SPJ Oregon newsletter. We'll keep you updated on things happening with the HB 4087 bill and any other initiatives that we're pursuing in Salem. And I think that's it for me. If you want to get a hold of me, there's my email, or you can go to my website or find me on Twitter. I'm pretty reachable in every way. So I'm going to figure out how to exit share screen and make sure there's nothing I missed here. So it sounds like we're good to move on to Q&A. There was a question here earlier from Chris May, so we'll start with that and move from there. If you have a question, you could put it in the chat and I'll try to get to it, or you can raise your emoji hand and we'll call on you. And we'll try to make this as organized as possible. But Chris May had asked during Christie Shaw's presentation, is there a map available that shows the areas where these wildfire protection jurisdictions exist and where there's overlap in the case of dual protection? Christie or Jodie, do you know the answer to that?
There's not a single map for statewide for that. Oftentimes, if you look at a specific dispatch center, they'll show kind of their coverage area. And then as far as like the dual protection parts, that really just kind of comes into play when it's inside of our ODF district boundaries and then another fire protection district boundary. But there's really not anywhere you can go statewide that has all of those boundaries covered. The closest thing you might be able to come to with it might be the OEM dashboard. They may have our boundary in there as well as the local fire district boundaries, but I don't know that they have the Forest Service kind of coverage areas as well.
It's really interesting if any of you have ever covered a fire in California. They have CAL FIRE, and it's just like massive organization that's super centralized, and it's so awesome covering wildfires in California because it's just so easy to just call a CAL FIRE PIO and they'll tell you exactly what you need to go. In Oregon, it's a little bit more disconnected, but we don't have as many, like, we don't have as much money as California. It would be nice if we had a system like that. Maybe in time we will have something like that, but for right now, it's kind of a research ahead of time so that when the breaking news hits, you're not surprised all of a sudden and not knowing where to go. Any other questions, or did anybody want to share an experience about covering wildfires that you wanted to share? Wow, I saved like half an hour for questions and nobody has any.
Well, I'm curious, so would it be helpful when we're on a fire to have that type of a map as journalists? Say if we take over a fire, I know we throw out all kinds of maps. By the time a type 2 team is on it, you're usually coming in, excuse me, coming in and checking in with a public information officer, because even with the changes, it's important that somebody on the fire knows that you're on the fire for your safety. So I'd be curious, does fire protection jurisdiction help with the story you're trying to share?
Since nobody's speaking up, I will say yes, that would be totally useful, mostly just so we know who to contact. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I do want to know though, Jodie, the Oregon Living with Fire is kind of a consortium of Central Oregon fire agencies, right? I mean, is there something similar for other regions in Oregon?
There is not right now. So I work primarily with, we have 2 forest collaboratives here, the Deschutes and the Ochiko, but then I also work with the Central Oregon Fire Chiefs Association. So I'm tied in there with all of the local fire chiefs in the Tri-County area. And where that becomes really helpful is when I do get dispatched to a fire. So last year in early July, the Darlene fire broke in La Pine, and I had been, I had come off of the Telegraph fire, largest fire in the nation down in Arizona. I'd been down there for 19 days, came home for the 4th of July, and then we got the call that we were going to be dispatched to the Darlene fire, which I'll tell you was pretty awesome because that's just down the road from my house. So when you get to work with your own forest, and Christie, was the PIO. So the fire was, and this is where that jurisdictional engagement really helps. So we had the public information officer from the Bureau of Land Management. We had Christie from the Oregon Department of Forestry for private lands. And then of course we had our local agencies. You know, the local fire district needs to still be running ambulance calls, needs to still be protecting homes. So we had this interagency response, but knowing Christie and having worked with Christie for the last, lots of years, we had that rapport so that when I came in as the acting team public information officer with my counterparts, we had 3 of us in our PIO shop, I was able to work closely, and I know Christie's style, and I know how to get information sharing. So that was really helpful to come in and have that on the ground, and to have some sort of local knowledge. So for Oregon Living with Fire, because I work with the partners in my day job on resilient landscapes and fire adapted communities and response, it transitioned into doing my job. Now, if I get dispatched and head up to, say, way northeast Washington, they do have a fire adapted communities network up there that I'm somewhat tied into, but it's just different relationships up there, and it takes time. And COVID didn't help any of us with those relationships. People have changed jobs. I'm sure there's been turnover in various news organizations. And so I really appreciate this talk and what you were saying, April, about, and Christie, getting those relationships forged before you're in the emergency situation, and having to find whose number to call, and are your cell phones even going to work, and all of that is really critical when emergency things happen. So that preparedness, I think, is really key. But there's nothing like this. We're the only one of its kind in Oregon.
Yeah, I would say that as reporters focusing on a local area, we have the upper hand in being able to do that, because when a really big fire hits, that's when you get people flying in from other news agencies. You'll get like New York Times and BuzzFeed, and you want to take advantage of being local by building those relationships now. Otherwise, you're just in the same boat as the people who are flying in from other areas. And really, when we have fires like this and we have reporting coming out of it, I think it's more important to have local coverage, because you'll already have that background and context of what the community is like and how this impacts them. Are there any questions?
I was going to say something about that, April, as well. So I will say that I always provide direction, and I know that the counterparts that I work with on the federal side do, that we prioritize the local resources, the local media, because you're telling the story to the people that are being impacted. And yeah, it's really cool to say, oh, the fire that we were, hosting got on, NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, but like, that's great, but I don't really think people in Florida really care that much about the communities that are impacted locally, whereas the stories that you guys are telling and the connections that you're making and the information you're sharing is locally. That's where we try to focus, because they're the people who are here all the time and that are impacted all the time.
Can I ask a question? Am I on? Hi, my name's Dan Morrison. I've been a freelance photojournalist for years and years. Covered the Yellowstone fire, in fact, but I've been covering the fires here locally. I'm at the University of Oregon now. I teach here as well as continue to work. I have a question. I can't remember which one of you 3, Jodie or Christie or you, April, mentioned you're on the committee working on the details for the House Bill 4087 training module. So that, to me, I read the bill real closely. And let me just say something. I don't know how many, I assume everybody is in this group chat, so to speak, is probably covered a fire, but I will make one observation. when you first go out there, you're probably not going to get what you want until the PIO becomes familiar with you and you earn their trust and they're convinced that you're not going to endanger anybody. Then you can get whatever the heck you want. But when you first show up, not so much. But in any case, and that also sort of segues into this H. Bill 4087. If you read that real closely, everybody seemed like they were doing a victory dance. Yay, we're going to be able to go wherever the hell we want. Not really, because in H. Bill 4087, it says the PIO still is the ultimate authority, and certainly the IC, but the PIO, as to where you go, they apparently they will be able to let you go unescorted if they want to. They don't have to. And with the new provision in there that says you're going to have this training, in some ways, it even gives them an upper hand more to say, no, you don't have the training. You can't go anywhere. So, I mean, I'm glad to see the bill pass, but it's not like it gives carte blanche to what they have in California, was wherever the hell they want to go. My question is, how is this going? Do you guys have even a rough framework of how this is going to work? How often it's going to be given? How rigorous is it going to be? What kind of training are we even talking about? Is this going to have a physical fitness component in it? Is it going to have first aid, fire behavior? What the heck are you guys even talking about with this training we don't even have yet, but we're going to have once this is implemented in January?
So
yeah, I will be clear. It's not the PIO who has that power. It's the incident commander. And
Yeah,
usually it's dependent on what I'll let Christie, you were going to talk.
well, hang on a second before Chris.
well, so it's the incident commander or their designee, which in most instances will revert back to either depending on the IA versus extended attack, it'll likely revert back to working with a PIO, public affairs officer, something along those lines,
Right.
As their designee. So it could be either or.
Right.
I'm on the subcommittee for the training piece, and Matt McDonald from Central Oregon Daily is also on there. He's one of the media reps in there, and we actually just met yesterday, and we've had several conversations regarding what's a reasonable expectation for time for someone to be able to meet the training standards. And so that's one of the considerations that we've taken into, and part of that too is how much of it can be self-directed versus how much of it actually has to be a proctored piece of the training. And then similar to what we do with our firefighting resources, we're discussing what's a one-time training certification piece versus kind of an annual refresher. Obviously things like fire shelter deployment, super important, and that would potentially fall into the annual refresher piece in there. But I do think we are trying to make all of those considerations, knowing that some, as Matt put it, he has reporters that 5 years from now are not going to be reporting or working in any type of the media field. And so having an expectation that it's going to be 100 hours worth of training is an unrealistic expectation for us. And so we are focusing really on what's an appropriate time frame to expect for training, and then what are the really important pieces of that training that's going to provide for the safety of whoever's out on the line, whether it's the safety of our firefighters in terms of parking and driving and that kind of thing by the media, but also the fire behavior piece of it that is going to provide for safety for those who are out on the line.
Let me just, an observation. I'd love to talk to you, Chris. I'm going to get in touch with you after this is all over, because I'll be covering, I've had nothing but good luck working with PIOs. I don't want you guys to think I've got an argument with PIOs. They've been incredibly helpful to me. And I got to cover bootleg last year and all kinds of, all the fires around here. But it's interesting to me. It's going to be a training that it's not the red card training, but it's sort of similar for the journalists. I mean, it's like you're supposed to know stuff okay, a lot of news organizations don't even think there's going to be covering a fire until the fire starts. I mean, and if it's only offered once a year, it's wow, this is going to be an issue. I'm sure you guys have already talked about this, but it's one of the things that concerns me is journalists who want to do this, okay, they don't even know it till the last minute. My God, a fire just blew up. Who knew that Talent was going to burn down, Talent in Phoenix? And who knew that was going to happen? Well, it did. And then it's too late to go to training. So it's not something I think that's on everybody's radar as a working journalist that, oh, by the way, I'm going to need to be qualified firefighter coverage person, just so you know. I mean, I'm sure you thought of that.
And for me, the way that I have looked at it and what we've discussed is that, we can still provide escorted access. And for me, again, like, because I'm big on relationships, is that I hope that this bill creates some better conversations, because obviously there was some frustration on varying parts where people weren't getting access and some things like that. As you said, it doesn't provide unfettered access. So you may still be kind of in the same situation, but I'm hopeful that we recognize on my side, on the information side, we recognize that we have failed our relationships. And so it creates a better opportunity for relationships out there for us to still provide access, even if someone doesn't have the training, because the concept of escorted training for folks who don't necessarily, or escorted access to a fire who don't have the training, is still there as an option. And we just need to do a better job of making sure that we have that ability. And again, trying to not make the training so that it's so cumbersome that no one is willing to do it, because it's just too much work to even go down that road.
Well, I don't mean to dominate this conversation. Anybody else wants to jump in, please do. But it's in the journalist's best interest for this to happen. Clearly, it's dangerous. I mean, most of the people in this group have been out and covered a fire, and they can go south real quick, and you can get in a bad situation real fast, and you better know what the hell to do. I've never had to deploy a fire tent and shelter in my life. I have a rough idea how to do it, but I've never done it. But I think you guys are it's not your fault. You're in a bind. We're right next to California, where, as I'm a photojournalist, and when I look at the pictures that Noah Berger has and Stuart Paley shoots, it's like, why the hell am I not getting pictures like that? I'm not allowed to. That's why. I mean, you were bumped up against here, the restrictions you guys, which you guys didn't come up with, but the restrictions you guys work under, and then our southern neighbor here, they have just damn near no restrictions. They go into unbelievable places. And I, as a photojournalist, I'll just tell you straight up, I'm selfish. I want to get nice images that I can compete with Noah Berger. I'm not going to get them. I'm not allowed to. And it's frustrating. Now, and I realize there's reasons for that, but it's enormously frustrating.
Yeah, and I spoke with Noah Berger pretty frequently as we were developing that bill and trying to figure out how to make it worthwhile. And even he would say the California law is too lenient. There becomes a huge, influx of people who just don't really know what they're doing. And, I will always stand by journalists. I think that there should be equal access, but I also think that for other people's safety, especially people who are new to the job, it's crucial that we know what we're getting into before we get out there. It's not just the fire itself, it's live wires, it's the heat, it's so many things that you don't really think about until you're there and in it and realizing, oh, I wish I brought this and that, or I wish I knew this and that. So yeah, I'm really hoping that this also helps us become better reporters too. So but yeah, we'll see what happens. We do have a lot of journalists part of the committee, so it's not going to be dominated just by agency interests. We have people who are ensuring that it's not totally cumbersome to journalists.
I fully support it. I mean, I think it's a great idea, but I'm just saying there's a whole lot of issues wrapped up in this.
Totally, yeah. Chris, did you have a question?
Not really a question, just sort of a general comment on some of my experiences covering wildfires. I definitely was not fully prepared for what I was getting myself into. I'll just say it up front. And similar to you, April, I just sort of got in my car and drove down. It was actually in 2020 as well, down in Talent in Phoenix. And one thing that might be helpful, even if you've covered fires before, that I experienced was sometimes I would get conflicting information from different sources. So as far as what areas are safe for me to be in, or that I was allowed to be in, a PIO would tell me one thing, the National Guard, like on the ground, would tell me a third thing. And then, somebody who thought I was a looter would call the cops, and they would show up and say, you're not supposed to be here. And so just keep that in mind. And the best thing you can do is just keep track of who told you what. And then if you find yourself being confronted, you know, have a press pass, be willing to sort of explain, you know, your process, and just also be, there's some people that just won't trust you, even if you say you're a reporter. There's a lot of misinformation. A lot of people had different ideas about what was really going on. So just also be prepared for that as well.
That fire was just awful and totally unpredictable. There were multiple fires happening that day. And I remember talking to police the same thing. They were like, oh, we're sending people to this evacuation center. Wait, that might need to be evacuated because now there's another fire going on over here. And I can overhear the cops just being overwhelmed themselves. It was wild. It was very wild. And I don't know that anybody really could have been very prepared for that.
Well, and that fire had embers going miles in the wind, and you had rumors and more rumors and more rumors. And that's where I really appreciate what Chris said about having your press pass or something that shows who you work for, because I remember one of the first fires I ever was a PIO trainee on, we had someone say they were a reporter. They were really just a local blogger person that wanted more information. Then they should probably been allowed. I mean, they were really a member of the public, but because they blogged and had some social media, they would call into the fire information line and as a reporter, in quotes, because we didn't identify that person as a reporter to be included. You know, they got the news releases and things, but they would often dig for other information to share within the community, sort of wanting to just be in the know. So not with malintent necessarily, but just wanting that sort of leg up from the other news outlets that we were working with.
I will say, if you run into somebody like a cop or a National Guards person who doesn't believe you're a reporter, which happened to me once before. I told him what agency I was with, Jefferson Public Radio. He was like, well, I've never heard that before. And it's like, well, I'm sorry you don't listen to public radio. Don't be combative, which is what I did. And it was totally not good. And put an emotional toll on me. The best thing I've found to do is to just move on. There are other areas you can go to, and if you're running into one problem person, just move on and find somebody else.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment as well. Like, it's not worth getting into an altercation, especially in a situation where there's already a lot going on. April mentioned libraries as good places to sort of lay low. That's also a good place. Like in my case, I wasn't exactly a local reporter, but I was from Oregon, and libraries can be good places to learn a little bit more about the community that you're in, a little bit of history, a little bit of context. So if you're already kind of, you know, maybe you need to step back for a little bit and recharge, you know, literally and figuratively, you know, it's also a good resource to get a little bit of info that might, you know, help distinguish your reporting from someone who's just sort of parachuting in and trying to get some, you know, sensational imagery or something along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing that. Has this sparked any other comments or questions among the remaining attendees? Well, since I'm not seeing any, maybe we can just wrap up early. I do want to thank everybody for attending, and especially Jodie and Christie for participating. Super informative, super helpful. I can't wait to go over these slides a little bit more because I was too busy managing this, but thank you so much for helping educate us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, guys.
This is a great opportunity.
Thank you. I'll post all this to spjoregon.com, like I said earlier, and you'll probably get an email in your inbox as well. All right. Take care, guys.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
Good day.
Bye.